Okay, good morning, Year 6. It's Friday the 8th of January, and we have our last lesson of English for the week. So today we're going to be using descriptive language and accurate punctuation. We're going to be using our work from earlier in the week to create a short passage of writing. We're going to be asking you to write 2 paragraphs. So let's move on. We're going to imagine that we are Zoe. She is retelling the moment she was chased, describing what she saw and how she felt. So you're going to need your word grid from yesterday and the picture that you drew on Wednesday. So I'll give you a moment to get those. You can pause the video if you need to. So today we would like you to use accurate punctuation, which we've talked about a lot in class, and some of that great language which you generated yesterday. So you know that from the work we've been doing in class that punctuation is really, really important. It helps the reader understand what you're writing, and it can create different effects as well. So it's really important that we use that range of punctuation that we've been learning about since we started back in September. Now, this is the word grid from yesterday. You can see that I've added a few more ideas. So if you didn't get to do yesterday's lesson, or if you wanted a few extra ideas, you can always refer to this grid. And this grid is also saved on the website as well. So you can choose. But I'm sure lots of you have got your own lovely ideas, because I know how brilliant you are at coming up with different language. So you'll be writing 2 paragraphs in first person as though you are Zoe. So we'll be using I. So you are going to imagine you are Zoe running down that street with the angry mob in hot pursuit behind her. So that is going to be the viewpoint that you're writing from. You're going to be describing the setting. You're going to be describing the way that Zoe is feeling and the mob who are chasing her. Now, you might want to pause the slides here and think about the order which you will write in, just like we would do if we were in class. What will you write about in paragraph 1 and what will you write about in paragraph 2? I'm going to share the way that I've decided to organise my writing in case that helps you. So in my first paragraph, I'm going to start with Zoe running down the empty streets and thinking she is on her own. She's going to be trying to get to her boat. And we know she wants to escape from the island. So that's what my first paragraph is going to be about. In paragraph 2, she's suddenly going to hear the angry mob behind her and catch sight of them. She's going to talk about how frightened she feels and how she's desperate to get to the boat. So those are my 2 paragraphs, but you can choose how you organise your writing. Now, just like we do in class, we're going to look at an example together to identify parts which we think are effective and why. And remember, today we're looking at using some fantastic descriptive language, so using that language really carefully and thinking about the range of punctuation that we can include. So I'm just going to move my little video box. And this is the first paragraph that we're going to look at. So my feet pounded over the cracked pavement. I had to get to my precious boat. As I flew past the long abandoned houses, I caught glimpses of the peeling paint, ragged curtains and cracked windows. I was about 5 minutes away from my hidden boat. By now, my legs were starting to ache and I was getting breathless. As I ran past the rusty cars and over the trailing weeds, which were forcing their way out of every crack, I began to dream of escape. Was I really going to be able to escape this time? Okay, now you can see, like we often do for part of the lesson when we're in school together, I've highlighted or I've underlined and put some of the words in bold. So those might be words that you want to look at and think, why has Mrs. Taylor used those? What do they add to the piece of writing? You can also see that I have highlighted some of the punctuation in blue. So you might want to look at that punctuation and think, why is that piece of punctuation being used there? What is it doing? So I would suggest that you pause the video and have a little look. You don't have to talk about everything. Have a little look at some of those different parts that have been highlighted or in a different colour and see why you think I made those choices. And then we'll talk about a few of them when you've had a chance to look at it. Okay, so hopefully you've talked about some of those. I'm just going to talk about a couple of them. So you can see up at the start here, I used a semicolon. Now, this semicolon is linking two complete main clauses, so two complete sentences. My feet pounded over the cracked pavement. I had to get to my precious boat. Now, I chose to use a semicolon there because it links two closely related sentences, and we've talked a lot about those in the autumn term. So it would be lovely if we could see a semicolon in your work linking two related sentences. Another piece of punctuation that I've used here is this comma after by now. So you can see here, I'm circling it with the cursor, hopefully you can see that on the video. So I've used by now, I've used that fronted adverbial to tell the reader a little bit about when my legs were starting to ache. So let's have a look at the whole sentence. By now, my legs were starting to ache and I was getting breathless. So this by now is a fronted adverbial and I put a comma after it, okay? So some of you are using fronted adverbials beautifully, but quite often we're forgetting to use those commas. So that's really important. I've also noticed a few things that I need to edit actually. So this started should be starting. So when I have finished videoing, I'm going to go back and have a little edit, but that won't be changed on your video. You may have noticed it. Okay, and the last thing that I'm going to talk about, the last part I'm going to talk about is this part. As I ran past the rusty cars and over the trailing weeds, which were forcing their way out of every crack, I began to dream of escape. So this part, which is underlined, which were forcing their way out of every crack, hopefully you've noticed that that is a relative clause. So it's in the middle of a sentence. It begins with this relative pronoun, which, and it's adding more information about the noun before it. So the trailing weeds. And the last thing to remember about those relative clauses, if they're used in the middle of a sentence, they need a comma to separate them from the rest of the main clause. And just while I'm looking at it, I'm just going to talk about this last question mark. Was I really going to be able to escape this time? So you can see that this question mark is at the end, and it's a rhetorical question. Zoe isn't expecting anybody to answer, but she's just thinking in her head. And it makes the reader think, is she going to be able to escape? Will she get away? Has she tried to escape before? So that's just me talking about some of the examples that I've used. And you can see, hopefully, that the language I've used is language from the past 2 days, which help the reader imagine what it was like when Zoe was there. Okay, we're going to move on now to, oops, hang on. We're going to move on to the second paragraph now. Sorry, I was just getting my slides a little bit muddled up there. Suddenly, a loud roar echoed down the street behind me. As I glanced back, a terrifying sight came into view. The mob had found me and were racing in my direction, bellowing, angry and threatening. My heart started to pound and fear shivered through my entire body. I thought I was safe. Faster than I had ever moved in my life, I bolted, every muscle straining. I had to get there. It was my boat. I was going to escape and no one was going to stop me. So you can see in that second paragraph, suddenly Zoe has discovered that people have found what she's doing and where she's going, and they've started to chase her. So if you pause the video for a moment, you can see there's not so much highlighted on here, but there's a couple of bits that I want to talk about. So have a little look at the parts which are in bold, sentences which are in bold, and these blue bits of punctuation. And have a little think in your head, why do you think I've included those in this piece of writing? And we'll come back and I'll talk about the choices that I made. Okay, so hopefully you've had a chance to think about it. Maybe there's somebody there who you've explained your thinking to. It might be that you've had a phone call with somebody from your class. Maybe you're chatting online about the work. So let's have a little look at this sentence. The mob had found me and were racing in my direction, bellowing, angry and threatening. Now, hopefully you've noticed this colon here. And again, during the autumn term, we did a lot of work on using a colon. So the way that we were learning how to use them was we were having a main clause, so a complete sentence before we added in the colon. And then after the colon, we were looking at adding a list of 3. So here you can see this is a complete sentence. The mob had found me and were racing in my direction. That is a sentence. It makes sense by itself. However, I've used the colon here to then add a list of 3, bellowing, angry and threatening. And those 3 words are describing the mob. So I'm giving the reader more information about what the mob were like. And when the reader imagines this crowd of people bellowing, angry and threatening, it will tell them something about how frightening it would have been for Zoe. So you might try and use a colon to introduce the list of 3 for your writing. Next, this sentence, faster than I had ever moved in my life, I bolted, every muscle straining. Now, when I was thinking about how fast Zoe was moving, I could have written, she ran really quickly. But actually, I wanted the reader to imagine how quickly she started to run. She's absolutely terrified and frightened that she's not going to get her boat. She's worried about what the mob are going to do. So I was thinking about Zoe and I thought she would probably run faster than she'd ever run in her life. So I've used that idea. I've also, instead of I ran, I bolted, which means when you suddenly move really quickly. And then I've used this dash to add on an extra piece of information, every muscle straining. So hopefully the reader can imagine that Zoe is putting absolutely everything into running and getting away from this mob so that she can get to the boat and escape from the island. Okay, so hopefully that's helped you a little bit. That's the kind of thing that we would be doing in class. I know you'd be talking to your friends and we'd be sharing, but it's good to think about maybe if you were in class, what would the people around you be saying? Which bits would they be picking up on? Which bits would they think were effective? Remember, we're focusing particularly on punctuation and your word choices. So now it's your turn. You're going to use the language you generated yesterday and the ideas from today, and you're going to write 2 paragraphs. Okay, so that's what we're asking you to do, just 2 paragraphs. If you want to write more, you're very welcome. If you're struggling to start, use some of the ideas we've discussed in the examples. So go back to some of those paragraphs that we've shared together, and you can use some of the ideas. Like we would in class, you might want to use one of the opening sentences or part of the opening sentence. You could also use some of the sentence starts on the next slide if you prefer. These are also on the website, so if you've got, if you're able to, you could always print them off, or you can just look at them on this video or open them on the website. So here are some sentence starters which you might want to use for paragraph 1. Breathing heavily, I was running to get to. As I ran along the street, I saw the houses were. I couldn't believe that. I felt, because as I ran, I started to. So you can use some of those, all of them, none of them, a few of them, It's completely up to you. And the same for these sentence starters, which might help you for paragraph 2. Suddenly behind me, I could hear. As I looked around, I saw. The angry mob were. I felt. I started. My heart was. So it's completely up to you whether you use them or you don't. But that's there if you think you need a little bit of extra support getting going. So when you've finished writing, take a break before you edit your writing. As you know, it's always good to just have a little step away from your work before you come back and look at it with fresh eyes. Now, as I've been doing this, this presentation, I've noticed a few things that I need to change in mine. So remember, it's an important step, editing, and making sure your writing is the best it can be. So it is important that you don't miss it out. So you might want to pause this video, go off, have a little drink, go outside, get some fresh air, just have a break and take a step away from your writing. Okay, so if you're back now for the final step, again, remember we said this is just as important as the writing and the collection of ideas. So we'd like you to, first of all, read each paragraph out loud. Okay, I know in class we do it when we have our fingers just lightly over our ears, don't we? But probably at home, there'll be fewer people around, so you could read it out loud and hear what it says. Maybe if there's somebody around, you could read it to them. So first thing to think, does your writing make sense? Or are there any words which are missing? Or any word endings which aren't quite right? Is it all in the right tense? Are you writing it in first person? So I. So just checking those things that we would normally ask you to check. Next, have you used punctuation accurately? So we're talking there particularly about those capital letters to begin sentences, those full stops to end sentences, those things that sometimes get missed off. So are there any other proper nouns which need capital letters? So all of that basic punctuation, have you used it accurately? Because remember, we talked about that punctuation being the cement, didn't we, for if you were building a house, the punctuation is the cement. Without it, the house would fall down. So without punctuation, your writing won't make sense to the reader. Next, have you used a range of punctuation? So remember the different options we discussed earlier. Think back to the work that we've done in the autumn term and all the different punctuation which we've looked at. Have you managed to use any of that accurately? And finally, you could underline the interesting descriptive language you've used to engage the reader. And if there's anybody around, you might want to say, look at this word which I used, look at this phrase which I used. This is why I chose it. Okay, so just have a really good second look at your writing to make sure it is the best it can be. And finally, remember that we would love to read the writing which you produce. So please ask someone at home to email it to us if you're proud of it, and we will enjoy reading it. And then we'll reply to you as well. So it's up to you now to go and do your task. And have a lovely weekend. Stay safe, and we will see you on Monday for another week of online learning. Okay, bye-bye.